Wastewater, working on African program and project to maximize the impact of those projects. I'm also working with SIWI, the Africa Regional Center. The reality today is quite sad, meaning that most of the used water, specifically in Africa, is released into the environment without proper treatment, with all the consequences that we know about in terms of health, in terms of ecosystem environment, and in terms of loss of opportunity to use this water. We know that. Now, we all here today, we all here at the World Water Week because we want to believe in a brighter future. So let's try to put ourselves in our mind, like in 10 years' time or 15 years' time, we're in a situation where African governments did manage to reach the target set up by the SDG. They did manage to halve the amount of water that is released into the environment without proper treatment. And they did it, it was very hard because obviously it was a huge burden in terms of financial aspect, but they did it with the help, they worked hand in hand with private sector. They used the knowledge, the expertise, and they used the financing available through private sector financing. So how did they do that? How can the private sector finance wastewater treatment in Africa? That's our session. And today we're going to have brilliant speakers from different backgrounds talking about their view on the topic. In terms of the program, we've got 3 parts. We're going to first have an overview of wastewater treatment in African context. Then we're going to talk about the trends, what is changing and what is bringing up opportunities for building the case around wastewater treatment. And the last session will be about, okay, but what's the trigger? If you want to change this situation, if you want to get more private sector financing, what should we do? These 3 parts will be separated with short Q&A and Menti question because we want to hear about your view on that. So you're going to have to use your phone and for this quick survey. And most importantly, we're going to end at the end of the session with a discussion with all the panelists. So please, if you have questions on comments or inputs, keep them also for the end of the session. So without any further delay, I'm going to start with introducing our first speaker, Mr. Diego Rodriguez, who is a lead economist with the World Bank in charge for water projects in the Southern African region. He's based in South Africa, and he also leads a global initiative on water in circular economy and resilience. So Diego will set the scenes, providing an overview of the situation in Africa with the challenges and opportunities linked to wastewater treatment. Welcome, Diego, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Should I use the mic or you can hear me in the back? Yeah? Is it on? Yeah. Yes, it's on? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I thank also the organizers. We've been working this group for this session event now for quite some time. So I hope we can unlock the opportunities that we can have in financing wastewater treatment in South Africa. I'm going to go very briefly on some of the more global numbers that we have. And these are basically the record that we have in the region in terms of access, universal access to water supply and sanitation. And here you see, as Lydia mentioned before, only 8% of the population has access to a sewer connection with wastewater treatment. That means that most of that water is being discharged with no treatment, causing all kinds of public health and environmental impacts in the region. According to estimates that we had from previous studies that we've done, the 31% of the global costs to meet the SDGs in targets 6.1 and 6.2 are in the sub-Saharan Africa, and they are around $35.5 billion per year. If you see this graph, that means that the cost will be in excess of 3% of GDP. Most of the countries here at sub-Saharan Africa of GDP are in Africa. And as you see there on the right-hand side, the targets, we are way off those targets. And in the red circle, you see the target on sanitation, that we need to accelerate that by 20-fold by 2030 if we want to meet those targets. Now, this is a multifaceted challenge that we have in the region. And what we see as main challenges, just to mention a few here, is that we have the tendency to invest in water supply and we leave wastewater for a later period. We have highly inefficiencies in how we use the public spending. Now we are using a lot of the public spending to subsidize capital expenditures, for example, but that capital expenditure is not really scrutinized against performance or outcomes. It's rather by output. So you build a treatment plant and then you can use the resources, and subsidies in sanitation are highly regressive, no? So they don't benefit the ones that need it the most. And we also have significant problems in the capacity to spend. We've done a lot of public expenditure reviews in which we see that more than 30% of the budgets that are allocated cannot be spent. Low public acceptability for issues like reuse. We tend as utilities to build infrastructure. We try to promote reuse for agriculture, for example, and there's usually a lot of rejection for that reuse, and we don't do a very good job ex ante of engaging with the communities, engaging with the farmers, to try and understand why this reused water cannot be accepted or used in the proper fields. No? I worked in Mexico, for example, in a project in Totonilco, a very large wastewater treatment plant, 33 cubic meters per second. When the plant was operational, the farmers downstream refused to use the water, and it took them 5 years to get into an agreement with the farmers. So we need to think a lot about these challenges ex ante. Users usually have a very low willingness to pay for wastewater because it usually goes out of the house and is treated far away. So low willingness to pay is a recurrent problem that we have. Institutional fragmentation, you have different utilities, you have city level administrators, you have river basin commissions. There's a lot of fragmentation and not clarity of functions, responsibilities, and accountability. Then we have obviously utilities with very limited capacity to operate the system. Some of the systems are quite complex and the capacity within the utility is not there. As cost recovery is very low, usually you see a lot of these wastewater treatments around the world and also in Africa that are operating below capacities or they are not operating at all. And then, of course, very related to institutional fragmentation is a lack of clear policy and regulatory frameworks. Many countries do not have the proper regulatory frameworks with clear and transparent rules for the private sector to come in. And these are many of the challenges that we face. But we have really an array of different opportunities now, and I hope we concentrate on this now, on how we can move forward the needle on wastewater. No? Africa is obviously facing severe water risks. This is the second driest region in the world, and the projections are clear that it will remain like this, and it's going to get. We're going to be facing much more scarcity in the near future as well. In the water sector, we used to think a lot about climate adaptation and the role, for example, of wastewater on the adaptation side. But now I think we have a great opportunity as countries move into just transitions policies, into the decarbonization space, to really think on how we can change the narrative on wastewater facilities, also contributing to the mitigation landscape. For example, another crisis is on the energy side. No? So many of these plants can generate electricity in situ. We have a food crisis in which you can extract phosphorus from these plants. Water scarcity, as I mentioned before, we need to think of reuse as an additional source of water. Reuse has to be part of the water balance in a city. It has to be part of the water balance in a basin level. We need also the systemic view of the policy institutions and regulatory frameworks. A lot of the regulations also that can promote the reuse or have certain limitations on the reuse are in other sectors. It could be in health, environment, energy. We need to understand the whole policy landscape. Efficiencies and subsidies. So how can we redirect subsidies for proper capital expenditures and operational expenditures? And here we are trying to concentrate on the notion of performance for results, performance-based grant allocation. So we can, instead of thinking of wastewater treatment as an output in the plant, we need to think of the outcomes that it generates and disperse against those outcomes. We need to think of wastewater treatment plants as resource recovery facilities. These are not wastewater treatment plants. You can recover a lot of those resources, and with that, you can incentivize with circularity principles, you can incentivize a different view from the utility as well, as you can lower operational expenditures to ensure the proper running of the plants by generating energy in situ, for example, or selling wastewater to industries, or you can generate excess revenues, additional revenues from the sale of those byproducts. So I hope with this we have good points for discussions, and thanks to all for coming.
Thank you, Diego. And I really like the fact that you end up with opportunities. And also that's what we understand. We are kind of forced now to see use water, and I'm on purpose not say wastewater, but use water as an asset and not no longer as a burden that needs to be wasted. So now we're going to hear with our second guest. We're very honored to have him today with us. Mr. Mchunu. Mr. Mchunu is a South African Minister for Water and Sanitation. Mr. Mchunu started his career in politics in 1991 as the first regional, then provincial secretary on ANC for the KwaZulu-Natal province. He was then appointed chairman-person for different portfolio committees: agriculture, social development, education. President Cyril Ramaphosa appointed Mr. Mchunu in August 2021 after having served as Minister for Public Service and Administration. So Mr. Mchunu will present today his perspective on used water and in the South African context. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Lady, and thanks for this opportunity. In the main, I want to thank you very much for putting our continent on focus. That is Africa in focus. This is a world stage for us. It's a great opportunity to talk to you on this very sensitive topic. Let me just say that I agree with the presenter from the World Bank, basically on statistics that he has shown here. We can easily confirm that the situation is actually quite bad in relation to water treatment in the whole continent. And what I want to add is that the situation can only deteriorate than getting better. And that's a huge challenge on our side that is facing us. But let me start with availability of water, because much as there are variations or alternatives in terms of water treatment or wastewater treatment or waste treatment and opportunities for business, but it all starts with water availability in the main. But I acknowledge that there could be other alternatives of dealing with sewer, which may not necessarily be waterborne, but we accept that the general standard that we should aspire for is waterborne sanitation throughout the world. That's world class. But what are our experiences for now? One, we have become aware that public sector, because of the deficit between the demand and the service that we're rendering on sanitation, generally as the continent, you saw for yourselves, only 2 countries almost in keeping with SDGs goal 6. It means the rest are lagging behind, and others are lagging even very, very, very much behind. And we all want to go forward. So we have to start thinking a little bit about water, availing water everywhere, and subjecting our sanitation services as waterborne. But then secondly, there is a challenge of finances, bridging finances, because you have to start far, and except for some urban areas, metros and so on. But even there, you have a problem of challenges of their own. Instead, what are the challenges in short? One, there's a challenge of capacity. Both in human resource side, there are skills to deal with this issue. But also, there's also a problem of finance to deal with this. Especially, I mean, from local, even national, we don't have enough money to deal with all the problems at the same time. But there's also another challenge which doesn't often get spoken about, that of awareness. Just make people aware of the need to deal with incremental, to deal with this particular problem, so that you use that opportunity of people who have become aware of the implications of underperforming on sanitation, health, and so on. That's our experience, is that's very important to create that awareness so that people can appreciate the problem rather than the trend of taking things for granted and not attending to them on time. Then our experience is that the private sector is much more willing, is much more upfront with what needs to be done, much more ready to make a contribution, especially mining in South Africa, to some extent agriculture, not to the extent that we would want it, but at the same time, I think there's space to persuade them to get more and more involved. The financial sector, not very much. We ourselves maybe are to blame to an extent because we haven't aggressively approached the financial sector to play a role here. But what has been a bit of a challenge is us, the public sector, responding to the willingness on the side of, or to any signal that we get from the side of private sector. So in other words, we have to catch up as the public sector, meet them halfway. When we assumed this portfolio in August last year, we had, as an example, one mining house which had been approaching our department for 5 years, 6 years, without any proper and concrete response. That is the indication that we're tracking, or we have been tracking, no longer now. So it took us about 3 meetings, and we were able to get an agreement with one local municipality somewhere in Limpopo, which is one of our provinces. We're able to, and that mining company wanted to build a wastewater treatment plant of about 2 billion, and then they would deal with that. They would manage that. They will maintain that for 3 years and hand it over to government. So what I'm saying is that there is indication of willingness. It has to be encouraged, and we then have to play the ball. There are 2 other examples of people wanting to invest. One is to the tune of a project that is about 10 billion in another province. Another one is a project that's going to cost about 24 billion rand, and want to do it on a 50-50 basis. So clearly the foundation has been laid in terms of attracting and the opportunity for private sector to play a role. What do we need to do is to come forward, and we are coming forward, is to craft relevant and adaptable models of cooperation between us and the private sector. We have largely a policy of PPP, this private public partnerships. That's working, but we need to vary that in terms of what's acceptable to business. What is it? If we do so, there's space, because they come with skills, they come with speed, they come with a promise of proper O&M, that is operation and maintenance post building. That's what we were encouraging. But recently, what we've done, just a little bit of a move, establishing an office, a partnership office with the private sector, which is a cooperation between us and DBSA, that's Development Bank of Southern Africa. That office is at its initial stage, but what are we envisaging? We're envisaging identifying some niches in this field where we would then cooperate. And we're hoping that in the next few months, those programs will mature, and they include even TESAL in some cases. They include reuse, that is reuse of water, wastewater, that was indicated here, and a few others. And we're hoping that these are going to grow, and these are going to mature, and these are going to operate. But we have a deficit in terms of this, and the consequences that, by and large, quite a number of towns, including metros, are characterized by spillage. Spillages, even on the residential areas. We're intervening as the department, almost to a point where if you like, taking over because of issues of capacity. And there's a challenge also on infrastructure, both on water and sanitation, which by and large would have been left unattended to. In some cases, infrastructure underground lasting for more than 100 years, that would generally not even leak, but it would just be none. And therefore you'll see patches of sewage dams, and that's what we want to eliminate. So what are we saying? We see an incremental opportunity for private business to play a role, and we see that there is growing acceptability, and that with us at national government intervening, opening up the space, definitely there is opportunity for private business to play a role, and we need it because of money, because of skill, because of capacity, and other related matters. So those of you who are actors in this area are more than welcome. We are the gateway as a national government, so that we facilitate things and in that regard, and also go downwards. But what is the overall goal? The overall goal is to improve health standards, to improve. We have revived what we call a green drop. We measured it. The results were out in March this year. And so we know where to improve and how to improve and how to go forward. So thank you very much for this opportunity to represent or to present our view. This matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Mchunu, for this. And what I hear from what you said is actually quite encouraging, because I can see that you are not only talking about we need to attract private sector financing, but more we need to be ready for them, because they are ready to support a government. And that's very interesting, because that's going to be one of our presentation about balancing the risk and opportunities of involving private sector from a public point of view. So stay tuned, that's going to be for the late part of the session. So now we're going to go quickly into a Q&A session. It's going to be quick. It's just clarification question if you have at this stage, because we're going to go for one specific survey question, the mentee. So while I'm going to ask you to maybe, if you have any clarification question, otherwise you can go directly on your phone and go into mentee.com and use the code to answer our first question, because we want to hear about you. So that's the question we would like to ask you today. So to improve the prospect of public-private partnership in Africa, what are the top priorities? And please rank them. So the first one is that we need to create a stable regulatory framework, meaning having proper policies, proper processes and institutions in charge for developing more public-private partnership projects. Second one, we need to highlight the respective responsibilities, duties, and expectations between private and public partners. The third one is what we hear a lot is we need to invest more in project preparation. So when we talk about project preparation, is that we need to invest into identifying the right project for PPPs, doing the appraisal, structuring, and tendering, and using PPP experience consultants. We also could encourage peer-to-peer exchanges between public partners during the development of their project for sharing knowledge, lesson learned, and expertise also. And the last one is we also should develop local capital markets, because they are the ones who could fund local projects. Oh, that's interesting. We're going to give you maybe 2 more minutes. And in the meantime, if you've got any clarification question, knowing that at the end of the session, we're going to run a proper discussion with all the panelists. Okay, well, let me just, I think we can close it now. Yes, I think so. Interesting. Can you go back to the result, please? So meaning that the first one in our reply was about creating a stable regulatory framework. Second one was in terms of project preparation, and then highlighting responsibilities between private and public partner. And I think the first one is actually what we hear the most. So the view of the room kind of reflect the consensus. Okay. Now we go to the second part of the session. Now we discussed about the settings, what's happening in Africa, what's the situation. We also have the views from a decision-making government, the South African government. So now we're going to talk about the trends. We're going to have our third guest, Delphine Gilbert. She's an investment principal at Norfund, which is the Norwegian investment firm for developing countries. Her focus is on deploying private capital in water and sanitation sector with a focus on sustainability. She has a background in waste, water, and energy industry. So she's basically going to focus on the ongoing changes, the trends, the dynamic that could support business case for wastewater treatment. Delphine, thank you, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Lydie. Good morning, everyone. Very glad to be here, and thanks for your attention this morning. So as Lydie mentioned, I work for Norfund, which is the Norwegian DFI. So we solely invest in private markets. So what I want to try to do this morning is to give you basically the private investor take and view on the sector and on the trends that we see today materializing, and that I think, as we said before, and as we're saying now, somewhat increasing the business case towards used water investments. So let's dive a little bit into what we've seen. And I'm not going to necessarily dwell on this too much, because we've talked already about most of it through the great intervention for Minister Mchunu, but also from the one from Diego from the World Bank. We've touched on it already. The first one, obviously, is climate change, and it's been dominating the conversation. It will do in the case of this event during the next days as well. It's creating, obviously, further water scarcity. The demographic pressure, especially in the African continent, is just a compounding effect on water scarcity as well. So basically, from an investor point of view, what do we see? A scarce resource. And so what happens with the scarcity? In general, there is, or should be, an increase in value. So what I'm saying here is a little bit provocative, because I'm not necessarily saying that we should, increase the tariff and sort of make people pay higher prices for water unilaterally. I'm not even going there. But what I'm saying is that from certain users, a scarce resource will have higher value. And so actually, it's really interesting what we've just heard from Minister Mchunu. Some people are already ready to commit money to this in order to increase their own resilience toward this resource. This is a really interesting, I think, first trend. The second one, and I think we've heard about it as well, we've heard about the energy crisis, and we know that this is only going one way. This is true across the board. This is absolutely not specific to Africa, but Africa may be somewhat worse hit because of the relative lack of resilience. We've also, heard about the lack of fertilizers. Imported fertilizers is also impacted from the energy crisis, and it's also a compounding effect of the food crisis that we have on the continent. And again, here, the link to wastewater treatment, it's because those two things, energy and organic fertilizers, can definitely be byproducts of used water treatments. And so really this used water can really be at the center of the circular economy and create or enhance at least the resilience locally. And the third trend that is important to mention, and we've also touched on it, but just a couple of facts, it's the public funding availability. And just a couple of figures I think that are interesting to have in mind is that over the past 10 years, the level of debt on the continent has doubled. And about, I think, 12 countries in sub-Saharan Africa have a debt to GDP level which is above 70%. So what does that do? It just affects the borrowing capacity. So is public funding going to be enough to bridge the financing gap of used water treatment? I think the answer is probably no, given the number of challenges that are there and need to be dealt with. So whichever number we want to attack to this funding gap, I think we agree that public funding will probably not cut it on its own. So that's all the trend that we've discussed already. And I want to highlight a few more. The first one is the availability of private finance. So there's never been, I think, as much private capital going around, and it's also flowing to Africa. In 2021, a report from AFCA, the African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association, has reported that the number of private equity deals in the continent have doubled from the previous year. So it's indicating a little bit of a trend that money is flowing there. The second aspect that is worthwhile mentioning is the amount of infrastructure deals. A fourth of those deals that were done on the continent, private equity, were infrastructure deals. And infrastructure, and that's true across the globe, has become quite an attractive asset class. It's not the crazy private equity returns that sometimes private investors look for, but it's certainly steady, it's certainly long term, and in the world that we live in, that has a lot of value. So something to certainly bear in mind. And the second trend so that we see is the fact that this private capital is certainly mobilizing. We can say that it's slow. If we compare to all the sectors, for instance, and certainly energy, what we've seen is that there's probably more capital that goes towards mitigation of climate change rather adaptation. I think around 5% of the climate change money actually goes towards adaptation or resilience. but it's increasing. And just going back to one of the comments that, private investors sometimes can have a little bit of cold feet going into the sector. I think we ran a quick survey within DFIs before we came here, and 100% of the respondents have said that they have higher targets of investment towards water and wastewater treatment. So the private sector has a willingness. And the last thing I just want to mention is the relative affordability. So it's well-known technologies. We know how to do this, and it's affordable compared to other type of technology like desalination, for instance. And I'm not saying we need one or the other. We're gonna, need a lot of the solutions, but it's not like it's, prohibited from a technology cost perspective. So we have a context that is rapidly evolving. We have those different trends. So we have a capital available, a willingness to invest, and a relative affordability. So the question is, how do we make those things match in order to mobilize further the private capital, because there is a willingness. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But I think first we're going to actually dive into a real life case study because this has been done before. Thank you.
Thank you, Delphine, for this excellent presentation, and also a very optimistic one. So it's good to see that the paradigm is changing. Private funding, it's becoming more affordable, and it's becoming also more attractive. So now let's jump into the following presentation. We're going to welcome our fourth guest from Namibia, Mrs. Berenice Ndetwa. Berenice Ndetwa represents the private sector water management company Veolia. She is the process and research manager at Veolia PPP project in Windhoek, which is Namibian capital city. She's a chemical and process engineering professional, and in addition, she serves as executive committee member of Upper Swakop Basin Management Committee, as well as the Global Water Partnership in Namibia. She's going to talk about two projects that have been set up, two PPPs projects, so real case that we can discuss today, implemented as PPP in Namibia. Thanks, Berenice, and over to you.
Thank you, Liddy, and thank you all for coming today. My name is Berenice Ndetwa, as it was mentioned before, and I'm just going to present the Namibian case study where we have implemented two PPPs, although very different, in wastewater management and potable drinking water as well. Okay, so just to give you a brief history about Windhoek and Namibia. It's a very arid country, and we've had a lot of droughts in the past. So in the 1950s, after a long conserved drought, we then decided to develop wastewater treatment in order to augment the water supply of the city of Windhoek after we had run out of water. So during this period, we developed the first Old Gorianga reclamation plant, in which we supplied potable drinking water from wastewater to the population of Windhoek. This was done in 1968, where the plant came online. And then after that, a demo plant was then developed in South Africa at the CSIR, where we thoroughly studied the impact of reuse on the population of Namibia. So we've had a long history with reuse as wastewater augmentation of the drinking water supply, about 53 years now. So in 2002, after the technology had been tested, after rigorous implementation of the reuse project, we then decided to build a second plant with better technology. During this process of developing the project, developing the case study, it was decided to go for a PPP, for the potable reuse facility that was built in 2002. That is then managed also by an O&M project by Windhoek. After we had thoroughly developed that PPP, and we saw the PPP was working for the city of Windhoek, we then went for the second PPP, which is Uyam's wastewater treatment plant, which treats industrial effluent. So I'll just take a deep dive into our PPP that we have implemented in the city of Windhoek. The first one here is Windhoek. Windhoek is a joint venture between Veolia and Vabag. Ringok came online in 2002, as I've mentioned before. It is a direct potable reuse facility, meaning we treat wastewater to a drinking water standard. So we extract the water, and then that is then sold to consumers around the city. It is about 21 megaliters per day production facility. It treats strictly domestic effluent, and it doesn't involve industrial effluent in the catchment process for this facility. So there's a strict separation between the two types of wastewater from the inset. It is a public entity. And the project itself, the Triple P itself, is an operation and maintenance project in O&M for 20 years, and it ended in 2022, and it was just recently renewed in June. So after the 20 years, the city of Windhoek then decided to renew the Triple P. Obviously, there will be contract negotiations still ongoing, but we will definitely still be operating and maintaining the facility for the foreseeable future. The capital cost for this project was about 110 million Namibian dollars, and it was funded through the KfW Development Bank. And then the second Triple P is quite different. It came online in 2011, 2012. It treats industrial effluent. So it is funded directly from tariffs from the industrial companies in the city of Windhoek, and it is a non-potable source of water. This is not for drinking, it's rather to mitigate for environmental reasons the wastewater that comes from industrial companies, so that we prevent industrial effluent wastewater from going into the environment. So that was the key purpose for this Triple P development in the city of Windhoek. It's a private entity. It's a build, own, operate, and transfer project for 21 years. It is also a joint venture by Veolia and Wabag. So Veolia and Wabag work very well together in the southern African region, and they have multiple, or they basically venture together into multiple Triple P streams across the southern African area. The financing was also done by the German DEG. Yes, and is quite different from Ringok because it has different goals assigned. One is to supply drinking water to the population, and then the other is basically to treat industrial effluent. Yes. So why did Windhoek opt for Triple P? One of the reasons I said was, as before, one was for D&B and the other was for O&M. So the objectives of the SPVs are quite different. And then also another thing was to ring fence financing within an institution in order to actually have money available for maintenance, which is very important, especially coming from a utility management perspective. Another thing was to access key international expertise. Obviously, when you start Triple P, you don't have the expertise in-house. And so you need to develop human resources, you need to develop financing models, you need to develop avenues for funding. And in order to do that, Triple P is one of the key solutions that you can actually implement in different cities. And then obviously it's to meet the developmental goals set by the local government as well as the national government. So the key benefits of the two Triple Ps that we have in the city of Windhoek is number one, climate change mitigation and adaptation. Because Windhoek is a very dry country, Namibia is a very dry country, and Windhoek in actuality is also quite dry. This was the key to actually meeting our water demand management strategies, and also to make sure that we had enough water for drought situations, which often occur. And as I mentioned before, environmental protection, increase in transparency and efficiency in the management of utilities was also very important. We play an open book, and we try to also engage stakeholders on various levels so that they can see how private sector can actually manage public entities, and also to inform the public on what is wastewater, how can we recover certain beneficial resources from wastewater and how that impacts their daily lives. So that is one of the key benefits that having a triple P in Windhoek has had. We have obviously increased the triple P capacity of the local entity, and we've created opportunities for local capital makers to actually play a role in investing in different opportunities as well in the opportunity. Yes, so we've had a few challenges in implementing a triple P. One of the key issues that you find, especially with reuse and water reuse augmentation for supply, is that you get a lot of resistance from the public. You get a resistance from, and in public, I don't only mean people, also from industry, because they would have to pay a higher tariff in order to treat the water instead of just dumping it into the environment. So you get a lot of pushback on that. But with and then another thing is also the complex value of water and cost recovery. Obviously, those are two opposing ideas where you would need to charge X amount for cost recovery of infrastructure implementation, and versus the right of water, or how people view and value water in different industries. Yes, and then long-term debt financing in local currency is also very difficult to come by, and then the upfront investment for feasibility studies is one of the very big issues for project development and project implementation. You need seed financing at the very beginning, which when you don't have a proved concept, it's very, very difficult to actually get this money into people's hands in order for them to actually develop the projects. So that's one of the issues and challenges that we have faced at the City of Windhoek. And then also a lack of institutional capacity, which has been spoken about by many of the various speakers. So how do we overcome these challenges? Very, very, very important is to get political buy-in. When projects are aligned with government objectives, it makes it much easier for private sector to actually get up and start running. You need political buy-in, you need that political capital in order to get projects on the ground, and to also continuously maintain the projects. You need that local institution to actually provide the regulatory oversight, as well as for the policy implementation on a ground level, on a local institutional level. So that's very, very important. And then for reuse schemes, particularly because I deal with reuse schemes particularly, you need a lot of public buy-in. You need public acceptance of reuse. You need public acceptance of the triple P itself. So that goes to stakeholder engagement. And then for triple Ps, you need political stability, as well as limited political interference in the operations of the project itself, because essentially it is private. You would only, yes, you would need very little political interference in terms of managing those projects. And then again, I have to emphasize this, the vehicle in which the solution is tailored needs to meet both the needs of the private sector and the needs of the public entity. It cannot be a one-sided event. It needs to be that both parties come to the table. Yes. So a wider perspective is in terms of the African continent and triple Ps. Triple Ps are not only found in Namibia, they're found everywhere in Africa, from South Africa to Morocco, Niger. And this is the Veolia Group has benchmarking in energy consumption, triple Ps in Ghana, as well as Niger, in irrigation and industry water reuse recovery in Morocco. And then also we have sludge to energy recovery in agriculture projects in Morocco as well, and digitalization and O&M projects also in Morocco, where they manage, it's one of the biggest facilities where they manage the whole municipal services in 3 of the major cities there. Yes, so I'd just like to thank you all for your time. Yes.
Thank you, Berenice, for this excellent presentation. And it was so interesting to also get the view from the private sector. We used to hear that there's sometimes a negative publicity with PPPs, you know, so hearing from the perspective from a private sector to know what was the challenges in terms of preparing, implementing PPPs, what are the opportunities also, and also what needs to be, what are the requirements for private sector and public sector to implement successful PPPs. So very interesting. Thank you very much. We go to the second and last quick survey for you. So that's the second one is, what are the key priorities for wastewater treatment in Africa to achieve the SDGs? So what should be the priority? What should be targeting in priority? Should we target environmental protection? So should we say wastewater treatment is very important because we need to protect the environment against pollution and protection of drinking water resources? Should we focus on resilience to climate change to prevent climate-related catastrophes such as flooding and drought? Should we also develop wastewater treatment market to use the byproduct of water, or use water, meaning energy recovery, organic material recovery, fertilizer production? Or should we also see that use water as a potential supply of water in the context of water shortage? It's quite changing. Yeah. Okay, I think the first one doesn't seem to change. So first target should be for environmental protection. Very interesting. And the second one, I think it's a very interesting one, because that's what I think it's changing now because of the shortage of water. We start to think about used water as a potential new source of water. So, okay, I'm going to close it. Can you just close it? Yeah. So now we're entering into our last part of the session. I'm going to invite again Ms. Delphine Gilbert for our last but one presentation. So what we've done so far, we talk about the overview of the African situation, the perspective from the South African government, the trends, and we see the change in the paradigm. We've seen an example of project by the private company Veolia, and now we're going to focus on what role, specific role for private sector. Now we've said that there's opportunities for private sector financing. We've seen that public sector is ready for it. So now concretely, what is that potential with private sector? And I'm going to hand over to Delphine again. Thanks.
Thank you, Lydie. So yeah, that's the home run now. So that's the last session. We have a couple of speakers and then we're done. So a bit more of your attention, but I hope this is captivating for you. So we've established there's money in wastewater, as somewhat provocatively illustrated on the picture behind me, but obviously not money that we want to flush down the drain, but money that we want to mobilize to extract the value from the used water, as we've discussed. So let's now focus a little bit more on how that can be done in terms of private sector participation. And what I want to do first is just to come back to the respective role of public and private sectors in order to make that work. So it would be, sort of a really sort of a common theme, and you've probably seen those different models that I have behind me on the slide already. But basically, there's different ways of doing things. On the sort of really right-hand side here on the table is where a form of contracting, where the public sector does most of the heavy lifting. From designing a project, doing all of the procurement, administrating it, doing the O&M, and etc. And usually just outsourcing the construction of the plant, all the way to a scenario where the private sector does most of the heavy lifting, and where you can see sometimes even private developers coming up with an idea, coming up with a project, funding it, finding private off-takers, and running it from A to Z. So I'm not advocating for one or another, But where private finance can be engaged is when we go to the left hand of the table, and once the project is structured as a private entity, then the private finance can be mobilized. And what does that do is that it releases basically the financial burden from the public sector onto the private one. And whichever scenario I think we embrace, but probably even more important when there is an outsourcing toward the private sector is the role of the regulator. And the regulator being, a word being used quite widely. And I think Berenice highlighted that really well on the real life case study. It's really important that this function is really embodied, whatever this body is. And sometimes it's a clearly separated regulator. Sometimes it's a different type of organization, but it's all the things that the framework within which the private entity needs to operate. So we're talking about tariff regulation, competition rules, quality standards, environmental law enforcement, permits, licenses, etc. The rules of the game needs to be clearly defined, because when the public sector outsource, it doesn't mean handing over control. It means outsourcing risk. And for that to be done well, the boundaries needs to be set by the public sector, by the regulator, not from the private entity. And from a private investor point of view, if that is not clearly well defined, things can go wrong. So it's a little bit more difficult. Once we go down the private sector route, and that's been, a choice, what usually can be a bit of a blocker. And I've just, got two things here that are usually quite common in terms of sometimes being tricky in order to mobilize private finances. And they are obviously the creditworthiness of the off-taker, and sometimes most of the time the water utility. And the second thing is around the bankability of the project. Bankability of the project, we talked about it at length already. That business case is somewhat being enhanced by the context where we live in. So that is improving. In terms of the creditworthiness of the off-taker, sometimes it's a little bit problematic. So what I just want to say, and I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but there are a raft of tools that do already exist. You have the lower cost of capital, you have technical assistance, credit enhancement, guarantees, and they live usually in financing institutions that have a willingness in order to catalyze further those projects and catalyze private funding. So those solutions exist. The problem is that it's somewhat complex sometimes to structure it, but let's not discard private finance participation, because it can be done and the project can be further enhanced. And what I just want to also mention a little bit before we close on this session is that ultimately the role of the institutions who have in-house a lot of the tools that I've just mentioned, so development finance institutions and others, it's ultimately to further develop a sector. So this is not about financing a sector, this is about being catalytic. So development finance institutions like Norfund, for instance, has really a mandate to crowd in. And one actor that we haven't really mentioned is the local private investors. So local private investors also sometimes needs the catalytic function of others in order to be able to invest and ultimately make a sector that is investable for local investors, and then those development finance institutions are not necessarily needed to be there. And why we can do this? It's because we have a risk profile from a private investor that is a little bit more aligned to those projects that can be somewhat difficult for classic private investors. So as a conclusion, what we've established up till now, I think in our discussion, is that we have a funding gap. We have private finance available. We've just seen that there are cases in which that private finance can be mobilized, and it doesn't mean giving away control, but it means outsourcing risk. That we have solutions to enhance those projects and make them investable from a private sector point of view. But what I will certainly recognize is that the structuring of the solution are somewhat complex. And what it really requires, I think, is further collaboration within all of the institution and organization, and to some degree, all of the stakeholders that are represented, on this panel discussion today, to further collaborate in order to multiply the case study that we've just seen before. Thank you.
Thanks, Delphine, again. And you highlighted actually the reason why we selected the stakeholder, the speaker today, because they do represent the stakeholder that have a say and have the power to make things change. Public government being the decision maker, private sector being the implementer, and the financing, development finance institution also. And we also going to have as our last speaker, think tank that knows well about water governance. So far we've been talking about risk mitigation for private sector. How can we attract more private sector into use water project, use water treatment project? But how about public sector? So how can they also balance the risk and opportunity of involving private sector for their project? I'm going to invite our last speaker, Mr. Anton Earl, who is the director of SEWE Africa Regional Center based in Pretoria in South Africa. As an environmental and development professional, Anton leads team in water management and development, facilitating the interaction between governments, civil society, and private sector for reducing the risk of investment in climate resilient development. Anton, welcome, and over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Lydie. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. As you introduced over here, we tend to focus on the risk issues related to investing in the water and wastewater treatment sector from the investor perspective. And they very well outlined, Delphine from Northfund just outlined that for us. But in my experience, working on some of these PPP programs in countries as diverse as Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Africa, Mozambique, there's also a risk for the official decision makers, the government officials that are tasked with taking these decisions to say, well, do we engage with the private sector? Do we bring them on board and share risk with them? There's inherently a risk for them that if things go wrong, it can be career limiting. It doesn't look great when you brought the private sector on board and somehow it didn't work out well. And I think that that's a component at a very human level that we sometimes overlook. And when we ask the question of, well, we've looked at the financial risk, the business model risk, the technology risk, and yet still the opportunity is not actualizing. And why is it that that is the case? So we need to start looking at the perception over here that decisions makers might hold as to seeing PPPs as being a high risk approach, and making sure that we are enabling them to really make the case as to why this brings added value for the public interest. Because everything that the private sector might be contributing has to, of course, be translated by your government officials into the public interest. Why is this serving the citizens better in a better way? And I think this is where we really have to start looking at this mix of risk between the public and the private sector. A few years ago, I was approached by the private sector head of a concession in the east of South Africa, a city called Mbombela, which is on the eastern side of South Africa, a little bit less than 1 million people living over there. And the concession had been running successfully, you may say, for over 20 years. But what had happened over the 20 years of the concession being run, it had somehow become almost a victim of its own success. It was running so well that the public oversight, the regulatory function, which was embedded in the municipality, had stopped operating in the way that it should have been run. But the private sector had been delivering the services, making the investments, things carried on going. So everybody was more or less happy with how it was going, and they could show all the KPIs were good. But the person that was heading up this company recognized that that actually exposed the company to a huge amount of risk, because if things did go wrong, things would look bad for them. So they actually said, well, we'd like to have SEWE support in training up the municipal officials to take over that regulatory function again. So very interesting. So there's a private company saying, we want to be regulated. We actually want that because that actually reduces risk from our side. And by doing that, it actually unlocked more finance from the private sector to say, well, now we are comfortable with actually upping our investment for the next 5 years in this initiative. So the issue of having a national level legislative and regulatory framework in place cannot be overemphasized. And we've seen this in various places we've worked. Ethiopia most recently has now implemented a public-private sector legislative framework that will actually make it possible for the private sector to engage over there. I think we've mentioned capacity building, and the capacity building is not just for government staff. So in the example I gave of Mbombela, the capacity building and training, we had the government staff as well as the private sector company staff going through the training program together. So in addition to building knowledge and experience and capacity, you're building trust between these two entities. And that also really helped in the negotiations of the next contract period. I think we could also play a role in documenting some of the good experiences in terms of PPPs across Africa, globally, of course. But in Africa, I think it's important to see what is being done in different African countries. Berenice from Veolia gave examples of several PPPs in the water space taking place in Africa. So it's good to document what worked, what were the challenges, how are these addressed? And there's a lot to learn over there. I'd also like to end with the statement, and it still needs to be tested, but it's something that could maybe be a window of opportunity in that involving the private sector in wastewater treatment might, and I say might, be less politically contentious than involving them in the supply of water services. Access to water is a very political space to be operating in, as the minister and his officials over here could very quickly tell us. So maybe a low risk way of actually starting to engage the private sector is by working in the space of wastewater treatment. Possibly, I'll put that out there for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you for that. Such a great conclusion also about opportunities specifically in the wastewater treatment. And maybe that's going to be maybe the first question I'm going to ask to you. So now we've run the 3 parts of our session. So we're going to start the discussion with you. So I will invite you to ask your question to the panelists, and I will circulate the mic to you. I will maybe in the meantime, while you're formulating your question, I will also take one question which was asked online. It's a question for Berenice from Veolia, and it's quite a simple question. It's with all the requirements and challenges that you have mentioned on those 2 projects, our online participant wants to know how long did it take for those 2 projects to start? So from the moment they were pre-identified, the discussion were starting up until the point that the contract was signed and then the project could be implemented, more or less. I don't know if you have this information, but it's more like an indication to show how complex those projects can be to set up.
Well, with most developmental projects in Africa, and I'm pretty sure everywhere in the world, it takes quite a long time. From the political decision-making, going back and forth, feasibility studies, well, should the project be implemented versus other projects? With Uyam's wastewater treatment plant, it took about 10 years. With Wingok, it was the first plant was built in 1968. It was online. From the decision-making process up until the plant is commenced, it takes about 10 years as well. So it's quite a long time because you do have to do pilot plant construction. You do have to do a lot of feasibility in terms of testing, finding the right financing model, those discussions back and forth between the private sector and the public sector. It does take quite a long time, but that is with all project implementation in terms of national development. It isn't unique to, say, the water sector. And I think 10 years in terms of decision making today and having a plant up and running is quite a short period of time. Even though it is surprising, it is quite a short period of time. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Berenice. And I'm sure that it's a learning curve. So the first time that you run a PPP project, a proper one, it must take a while, but then the second one and then the third one. So, okay, thanks. Is there any question? Yes. I'm going to start with, can you give your hand to Mr. Minchulu, maybe? Okay.
Thank you very much. It's rather a comment more than a question. A comment that says that these time frames obviously are no longer desirable. Yet they're there and they're happening. But the critical point is to make is to say, not because these time frames they're not a must, in other words. And that's very important. Rather, we need to change because time is not on our side, with impatience, with the damage, with the consequences of not implementing projects that need to be implemented on time. It's not on older people or old governments, it's not on young people, it's a mix. And we really have to change and change on time. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Mr. Antonio. Yes, I think we've got a question also there and here. Yes. Are you? Okay, no comment. So even here, yeah.
Sorry, I won't direct this question either the World Bank or no fund. And the three questions are: surely you cannot achieve bankability without revenue generation for services rendered. So when you're talking about Africa, you're talking about poverty-stricken zones, and the question is, what are you doing in terms of enhancing revenue generation from these facilities? The second question is, when you look at lowering the cost of capital, surely it's not from a finance perspective. What I can't understand is, why do we pay so much for technology that we bring into the country? Is there not a strategy around reducing the cost of capital of technology that we implement? The third point is around incentives. Now, when we talk triple Ps, we're directing it to entities that are purely have a vested interest in this facility. Shouldn't we look at an incentive mechanism to open it up wider to a broader spectrum of people who may want a green tax? If you look at what the Danish did in terms of water loss reduction, they introduced a green tax and it got water losses down to literally single-digit figures. So those are the three comments and strategies that I think that the World Bank and Norfund should look at. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So I hear the three: one, enhancing revenue generation. How can we do that? Reducing the cost of capitals of those technologies are the way also of reducing that cost. And the last one is like providing incentive to develop more of those projects. Yeah. I don't know if Delphine or Diego wants to start or.
I'm going to address, so that the first one was on the revenue generation. Yeah, so there I think there are two different avenues that we work with client countries. Now, the first one is the improvement in the efficiency of the running of the utility to at least lower your operational expenses. So it's internal processes in how you operate your systems. It's, for example, energy audits to improve the energy cost or lower the energy cost. It's on, what we do a lot is on existing infrastructure. We conduct this optimization routines in order to be able to enhance for example, the capacity of wastewater treatment plants. Wastewater treatment plants are usually designed taking, the coefficients and the formulas from standard engineering books. When you start running them, you'll see that in many cases, and we are doing a massive study now in working in São Paulo in Brazil with a water utility, in which by reoperating and making those plants more efficient, the existing plants can treat more effluent, and they are saving billions of dollars in future investments, right? So you delay the investments, which bring you an additional source of savings. The second one is what we are mentioning is this notion of byproducts. Even in some smaller wastewater treatment plants, you can see, for example, in some cases in Mexico, we have some small wastewater facilities that are running 100% on renewables, right? Or when you generate in situ energy and you're able to have 60%, for example, lower energy cost, or the aspects of byproducts in terms of sludge, or what we call the purple lines, which is selling reused treated water, for example, for industrial purposes, right? So we bring a lot of this notion in the design, and that's linked also to the incentives. We have to make sure that the regulatory framework provides the necessary incentives for when you have bidding processes coming from the private sector, that you incentivize those projects that bring those additional either lowering of cost or increasing in revenues. So it's all about also the incentive structure that must be there. No? I think I'll give you the floor so I don't monopolize.
Thank you. And I don't have, necessarily much more to add to this. The thing around revenue generation, I think what is really interesting with the case of reused water treatment is the multiplication of off-takers. So many different parties can be involved, and then not just, the municipal or the water utility to cover the service cost. And I think really trying to leverage from that is certainly an avenue that is de-risking and enhancing the cash flow of the project. And then just the other thing that I just want to mention, because I've been constructing plants before, and you're talking about the cost of technology, there is also the cost of the project, and it's not the same thing. And cost of technology sometimes is not necessarily prohibitive, but building with a plant can be prohibitive. And I think this is where, again, there needs to be a really transparent collaboration in order to make sure that the cost of the project are controlled and ultimately affordable. But technology is not necessarily the most expensive. I think the project is. Thank you.
The delays, in terms of the building, that's what is very costly for the project. Thank you, Diego, and thank you, Delphine. Got a question. Can I ask you to introduce yourself? Sorry, I forgot. Okay. That's you after? Okay, sorry. Can you introduce yourself before you ask the question?
My name is Rolf Eberhard from South Africa. I want to respond to the minister on the time issue, because I think there are opportunities, particularly if you think about projects in a portfolio of projects. And there's a very good example in South Africa where that was done extremely well in renewable energy, where they organized bids for wind and solar projects, but they had a portfolio, and then they had each bid window, they learned from the previous one, so they could accelerate the timing of those cycles as they learned. And so I think in wastewater in South Africa, there's enormous opportunity, because that the green drop assessment that you referred to showed that there were hundreds of systems that needed upgrading, right? So there are a large number of systems that are very similar. The scales might differ, but the approach can be the same. And you could adopt a similar programmatic approach for that with the portfolio projects. And I think one of the recommendations, maybe I'd like a response also from the panel, is the need to get all the players together right from the beginning in the design of the program. So bring in the investors, bring in maybe the private sector, although there might be a conflict of interest there, but bring in the DFIs and create the capability to do the design well from the beginning, because that will stand in good stead further down the line.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, we hear a lot of similarity between the renewable energy program in Africa, the way they have upscale because of the way it was structured with call for proposal and those for IPP's project. So there's a lot to learn, I mean, from the renewable energy sector. Thanks.
Yeah, my name is Claes Clifford. I'm from Nyers in Denmark. I was just interested to hear the thing about, there was quite specific in the Windhoek case where there was a client, I mean, the case that was quite specific about separating the kind of domestic waste and industrial, waste treatment. And it was quite clear because what we see and around normally is that when you have in bigger cities, particularly also, I mean also in Asia, is that you will have like a huge kind of mixture of textile industry, industrial industry, and domestic and whatever not. And then you have this kind of mixture. And when you talk about reuse, you have to somehow treat it to be somehow reused for something else. Then you have a treatment plant without really have a problem. It's really either expensive or it's really complicated to really treat that complete mix of somehow water. So I just want to ask whether instead of trying to do that, or maybe not even realizing that eventually you will have that problem specifically if it is a private sector who cannot control the quality of the incoming inflow. But they have to guarantee somehow a certain kind of quality of what they have to somehow deliver. So is it better just to say from the beginning that you need to somehow, or is that a recommendation? You just need to separate the inflows. You need to have that kind of separation of textile industry, which is, whatever can be in that one, and more kind of treatable domestic waste. You have to have that from the beginning. Because otherwise you will face these issues.
You want to on that one? Mm-hmm. Would you like to?
I'll just give a brief answer to this, and then I will give the floor to Dr. Langsteiner, who's also one of our directors at Windhoek. Because of our history, and we started doing reuse in the 1960s, we already built in the multi-barrier approach that we would separate industry from domestic effluent. But obviously, this was foresight from the people in the city of Windhoek that they would separate these two streams, but it wasn't done, say, in other cities. So because of that, there are various other solutions that can be implemented that you maybe require industry to pre-treat effluent before putting it into the distribution system. It might be that, as you've said, you would then have to build the cost recovery into the tariff or introduce some sort of subsidy in order to get enough financing for upgrade projects for the treatment in order to do reuse. And also where you target your reuse, you can have large scale and small scale reuse within cities as well, especially for, say, European cities. It would be definitely different from the Namibian case because we did start much earlier. So it is quite more developed. And I will just, if you would like to add anything.
If you can quickly, because we're going to have to close. So sorry. Thank you.
Yes, in Windhoek, they have a multiple barrier approach. They have treatment barriers and non-treatment barriers. And a very important non-treatment barrier is, as you said, the separation of industrial wastewater or used water and domestic used water. So the source water for potable reclamation is domestic sewage, not contaminated by industrial used water. Another non-treatment barrier is blending the reclaimed water with treated dam water and groundwater. And source control of this domestic sewage is, of course, done in monitoring along the treatment plant. And the treatment barriers are an advanced multiple barrier system with 8 to 9 treatment steps. So it's a very safe approach. Treatment barriers and non-treatment barriers. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Unfortunately, we're going to have to close now, but you're more than welcome to ask your question directly to the speaker after the session. I hope you have learned a lot, and I hope that you have got a lot of insight also from those discussions. I'm just going to hand over for the last word to Mr. Mchunu, maybe to reflect with 1 or 2 sentences about the panel discussion. Thank you, Mr. Mchunu.
Thank you very much, Lydie. One, I think overall, what seems to be quite important is to exercise leadership, whether it is political leadership, is business leadership, or even NGO leadership. Place it on par, have willingness to engage, and things will work out, as opposed to, because it doesn't mean that political leadership is endowed with wisdom that will work for all the time and so on. Some dynamics play in and it becomes a problem. So let's interact and share information, make everybody aware. Secondly, is transparency, an elimination of corruption that will make things work. If we're not transparent, all of us, in the way we deal with this, I'm sure business will always tend to drag because they don't want bottomless pits and so on and to draw their money there. And the last one is cooperation, which is extremely important. Remember, here there are no two parties, not just government and business. There are people on the ground. There may be a third party and not always have somebody to speak for them. But really, that's the most important component in whatever we do, government and business. And they mustn't be shifted to the backyard all the time. They are in the fore because we profess to assist them. Even the worst dictator will say, I'm working for people. And therefore, that must be scrutinized, that working for people all the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mchunu. Let's cheers to transparency and cooperation between private and public. Thank you, everyone. And I would like to thank you, our speaker and our panelists, for all their work and the very interesting discussion we have today. And thank you all for attending our session. And thank you to people online also. And have a good day. Thanks.
Thank you.